During the will reading, my dad slid the folder away from me and said, "You don't deserve 26 million Quinn, you never built anything." His voice did not rise, it did not tremble. It simply carried the cold finality of a man who had already decided I was insignificant. The chair under me felt suddenly too small, too fragile. My hand was still resting on the folder when he pulled it from beneath my fingers and pushed it toward my sister Lena. She let out a quiet laugh, sharp and satisfied, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. Martin the attorney cleared his throat and looked down at the documents, refusing to meet my eyes. The room smelled of fresh coffee and copier toner, the kind of scent that should have felt ordinary but instead felt suffocating, as if it was sealing in the humiliation spreading through my chest. I sat across from the people who shared my last name, yet in that moment they felt like strangers who had rehearsed my erasure in advance. Outside the glass wall of the conference room, the mountains stood solid and bright against the March sky, but inside, everything felt airless. My dad tapped the folder and said, "Lena is the one who actually understands business. Quinn decorates hotel lobbies and calls it work. Not even decorates," he added without glancing at me, "she just moves little pillows around." The insult landed quietly in the room but violently in my chest. I felt the heat climb up my neck, yet my face stayed perfectly still. I learned a long time ago that stillness is the only shield you get in a family that treats emotion like weakness. Martin continued reading the will, his voice wavering slightly. According to Arthur's original draft, the 26 million was intended for the family member who demonstrated the strongest ability to carry on his hospitality legacy. The description fit me exactly. But before anyone could acknowledge it, my dad cut in with a dismissive wave. Dad told him he had spoken with Arthur before he passed. He said Quinn cannot handle real money. The words echoed in my mind longer than they echoed in the room. Arthur, my grandfather, the man who taught me everything from front desk etiquette to profit margins, had never once doubted my ability. Yet here was my father rewriting a dead man's final intentions as if they were his own. Lena placed her hand on my arm in a performative gesture of comfort. She whispered, "It's for the best, Quinn. Dad and I can take it from here." Her nails pressed into my sleeve just enough to remind me that this was not kindness. It was conquest. I did not respond. I kept my eyes on the folder even though it was no longer mine to take. The betrayal tightened around my ribs until I could barely inhale. When I finally looked up, the lights above seemed too bright, and every sound felt magnified. The scrape of Martin's pen, the tick of the wall clock, the faint hum of the heating vent. I felt small but not broken. Not yet. My silence was the only thing holding me together. I had learned to survive these moments by observing rather than reacting. And while everyone in that room believed they were watching me fall apart, I was already noticing what they missed. The signature on the final page was slanted in a way Arthur's never was. The notary stamp was dated 2 days after he had been admitted to the hospital. The witness line contained a name I had never seen before. Each detail was a thread, and if I pulled even one, the whole fabrication would unravel. But I said nothing. I let them believe their performance was successful. I let them think I was defeated. They assumed silence meant surrender. It never has. They also assumed that the only thing I ever built were pretty hotel rooms. That was their real mistake, because the next day they would learn something none of them had bothered to ask about. The building we were sitting in, the very conference room where they tried to erase me, belonged to me. The Hearth Denver had been mine for nearly a year, purchased quietly through a holding company Arthur himself encouraged me to create. He said, "One day you will need a foundation that cannot be taken from you." I never imagined he meant it this literally. After the reading, I walked out of that glass room with my face calm, my heartbeat steady, and my future rearranged. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I did not ask why. I simply watched the people who claimed to love me reveal who they truly were. That night, when the city glittered under the Colorado sky, I sat alone on my couch, staring at the copy of the will Martin had slipped me while pretending to gather papers. He had whispered, "Check the dates." That was all. My phone buzzed a new email arriving at the top of my inbox. The sender made my breath lock in my throat. It was from Arthur, dated 10 days before he died. The subject line read, "If Richard touches what is yours, here is what you do." If you have ever seen someone rewrite your worth to benefit themselves, tell me where you are watching from. The moment the folder left my hands, the humiliation settled across the room like a dense fog. Richard leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who believed his authority was unquestionable and said, "She has always been the quiet one, the dreamy decorator, the child with no head for numbers." He said it lightly, as if it were a harmless observation, yet every syllable was a dismissal, sharpened by years of repetition. I sat still, letting the words pass over me, because reacting in this family never changed the outcome. Quinn, 28. The supposedly aimless daughter who plays hotel in Denver. Lena, 31, the golden child with a history of failed online businesses. That was the unspoken summary in my father's tone, and everyone in that room understood their place in the hierarchy he had built. Lena leaned in close and placed her hand on my arm with the fake sympathy she had perfected over the years. "It is for the best," Quinn, she whispered, as though I should be grateful that the 26 million had been rerouted to her. Her smile never reached her eyes. It rested on her lips like a trophy as she lifted the folder toward herself. The attorney Martin avoided my gaze entirely. He looked down at the documents as though the printed words were more deserving of his attention than the living, breathing granddaughter of the man whose will he had read. His pen clicked nervously in his hand, and the faint tremor in his wrist told me there was more discomfort in him than he dared reveal. I watched him carefully because people who are afraid sometimes reveal pieces of the truth before they intend to. Behind us, the glass walls reflected the morning light bouncing off the Denver skyline and the snow-tipped mountains in the distance. They looked so steady and unchanging that it almost felt absurd that my life had been rearranged inside this sterile conference room with its metallic hum and scent of freshly printed paper. Richard tapped the document again and said, "Quinn has no head for numbers. She never did." He added that I lacked the discipline real responsibility requires, and that Lena had always been the builder in the family. I did not move, but I felt something small and sharp twist inside me at the mention of that word builder, because my grandfather Arthur had used the exact same word when he spoke about me. He had said Quinn is the builder in this family, the one who sees what a place could become. But Richard continued undeterred by memory or truth. He said, "You have always been a burden, not a builder." The insult hit harder than the financial betrayal because it was not new. It was a polished version of something he had been saying for years. Lena sat taller, as if absorbing each compliment meant for her and each insult meant for me. Her posture communicated one thing: victory. Martin cleared his throat again and resumed reading the legal language with a forced neutrality. According to the clause in the draft, Quinn was meant to inherit the portion designated for the family member who had demonstrated the strongest potential to carry on Arthur's hospitality legacy. I watched both Richard and Lena shift at that line ever so slightly because they knew it pointed to me, even if they refused to acknowledge it. Richard interrupted before Martin could continue. "My father changed his mind. Quinn decorates hotel lobbies. That is not a business. She plays hotel with throw pillows while Lena handles real responsibilities." Again, the room absorbed the insult with a silence that felt complicit. No one contradicted him. Not even Martin, though I saw discomfort cross his face. He knew something. He must have. I stayed still. My silence was never weakness. It was observation. And observation always revealed more than anger ever could. My eyes drifted toward the corner of the document where the signature sat. Arthur's name looked wrong. The slant was unfamiliar, the pressure uneven. My grandfather signed with a steady hand even toward the end, and this signature looked rushed, almost hesitant. A small line of correction fluid caught my eye near the edge of the text. When I leaned in slightly, I saw the faint imprint of handwriting beneath it. My heart pressed hard against my ribs, not out of panic but out of recognition. Someone had altered this. The seal at the bottom looked fresh, newer than it should have been. The embossed edges were too clean, and the date printed above it landed 2 days after Arthur had been admitted to the hospital. My mind cataloged each discrepancy, the way one does when reading a blueprint for structural flaws. The changed date, the altered name, the unfamiliar witness signature. They formed a pattern that whispered one word: fraud. But I breathed slowly and kept my voice within me. Reacting would only feed their narrative. Observing would give me control. Lena adjusted her posture and said, "Dad did the right thing. I need the money more. I have a family." Quinn plays with boutique hotels because she likes the color of the walls. The cruelty was casual, almost effortless. I wondered if she had rehearsed those lines in advance. Richard nodded as if the matter was closed and said Lena will handle the $26 million responsibly. That is final. But nothing in this room felt final to me. My grandfather had trusted me with the truth, even if these people had convinced themselves they could erase it. And something in the quiet unease on Martin's face confirmed that the truth was still here, waiting to be uncovered. I shifted my gaze once more to the portion of the text where the correction fluid sat. The faint strokes beneath it became clearer as the morning light angled across the page. The original line had read to my granddaughter, Quinn Hayes. The handwriting above the correction changed it to my granddaughter, Lena Hayes. My pulse steadied. They thought they had written me out. They had no idea what they had just begun. Back in 2018, when most of my friends were busy planning careers that made sense on paper, I found myself standing in front of a run-down motel on the edge of Denver. The paint peeled from the walls. The neon sign sputtered in the cold air. The parking lot was cracked from years of neglect. It looked nothing like a future, and everything like a warning. Yet my grandfather, Arthur, handed me the keys with a quiet smile that reached deeper than any compliment my family had ever given me. "Try this," he said. "See what you can make of it. No pressure, just possibility." I had no money to renovate and no reputation to hide behind. What I did have was instinct. I walked every hallway. I touched every surface. I made notes in a spiral notebook about what could be saved and what needed to be reborn. I spent nights sketching layouts while everyone else slept. During the day, I scrubbed rooms myself because hiring a team was not yet possible. By the end of 2019, the motel no longer felt like the sad, forgotten place I had inherited. It felt like a canvas, finally showing its colors. And by early 2020, Hearth Denver opened its doors for the first time as a boutique hotel, built from my own hands and my own stubbornness. On its second month of operation, it hit full booking. Word spread through social media about a small, beautifully restored property run by a young woman who remembered every guest by name. Travel bloggers wrote small reviews. Locals recommended it to visiting family. It grew without fanfare the way real things often do. My family did not see any of it. They only saw the pictures I posted on Facebook. A few photos of new lighting fixtures, a hallway arrangement, a mirror from a vintage store. To them, it looked like Airbnb decor, cute and temporary and trivial. When Arthur invited them to visit, they always had excuses. Once when he suggested Richard come see the progress, he said, "I do not do side projects." I remember hearing that sentence through the phone and staring at the fresh lobby with its warm oak counters and soft lighting, and feeling the weight of dismissal settle deep inside me. But I kept building. In 2021, after Hearth Denver became consistently profitable, a small investor reached out about opening a second location in Boulder. It was an old craftsman-style inn with uneven floors and a roof that needed more work than I wanted to admit. But its bones were good. You learn to trust bones when you work with old buildings the way you learn to trust patterns when you work with people. I redesigned it from scratch. 6 months later, Hearthboulder opened with a ribbon cutting that garnered a full page in a local magazine, though my family did not read it. In 2022, I added a third location in Colorado Springs, then another in Santa Fe in 2023. Each one took a piece of me and returned something larger: stability, reputation, a quiet strength my family never cared to see. During family dinners, no one asked how the hotels were doing. No one asked how I managed to fill rooms in off-season or negotiate vendor contracts or train staff who later became managers. Instead, they asked questions like, "Are you still playing hotel?" Lena in particular seemed to enjoy the phrase, "must be nice playing hotel," while Dad handles the real family business. She said it with a velvet sharpness, as though every success of mine threatened the fragile idea she had of herself. I never corrected her. Correcting her required recognition. Silence kept me free. There were moments, though, when the distance between my real life and the version they believed became almost absurd. Once when I received my quarterly report for the Denver property, a report showing a profit in the 7-figure range, I was alone in my office reviewing the numbers with quiet pride. It was not the money that moved me, but the proof. The proof that vision and labor could turn a dying building into a thriving enterprise. The proof that Arthur had been right to trust me. My phone lit up with a FaceTime call from Richard. I closed the report before answering, as if hiding something intimate. He asked how I was. He did not ask what I was doing. If he had, I might have told him I was reviewing a report that would have stunned him. Instead, he said casually, "Lena is thinking of starting another business. Maybe you can help her with some decor ideas." Decor. That was the only part of my world he found relevant, and even that he saw as superficial. I learned not to offer details. People who do not believe in your work do not suddenly start believing because you explain it. They believe when the truth becomes undeniable, and even then, they resist. The more the hotels grew, the quieter I became, not out of shame, but out of protection. The less they knew, the safer my work felt. Yet there was one person who always saw the entirety of what I was building: Arthur. There is a moment that returns to me, often, especially now after everything that happened. It was during the first week Hearth Denver opened. We walked the hallway together, the floor still smelling of new varnish. Guests passed by and complimented the warmth of the space. Arthur rested his hand on the banister and looked at me with an expression I had rarely seen in my family. Respect. "I am naming you in my will, Quinn. They do not see you now, but they will." At the time, I laughed softly, thinking he was exaggerating. I had no idea how precisely he meant those words, or how violently someone would try to erase them. Now, as I sat in that conference room in 2024 with the altered document in front of me, those words returned with the weight of prophecy. My grandfather had understood something long before anyone else did. He knew the family would overlook me. He also knew the world would not. And somewhere deep within the years between 2018 and 2023, while I built 4 hotels from dust and instinct, I became the woman who could withstand exactly the kind of betrayal I had faced hours earlier. I just had not realized how soon I would need to prove it. That night, the city felt louder than usual, even from the quiet height of my apartment. The lights of Denver stretched beneath me in long, trembling lines, and for a moment it seemed as if every window in every building knew what had been taken from me. 26 million. A number that should have felt abstract instead pressed against my ribs like something sharp and personal. I set my keys on the counter and stood in the dim kitchen without turning on the lights. Darkness made it easier to breathe. I poured a glass of water, but when I lifted it, my hand shook just enough for the surface to ripple. Not from fear, not from shock, from the weight of everything I had swallowed in that conference room. I carried the glass with both hands and walked to the window. The city glittered with its ordinary confidence, while I stood still, feeling freshly hollowed out. I pulled the folded photocopy of the altered will from my coat pocket. Under the soft glow of the streetlights, dozens of floors below, I read the same line again and again. To my granddaughter, Lena Hayes. Each time the words shifted into a heavier version of themselves, as if repetition added mass. My name replaced, my grandfather overwritten, my existence translated into absence. I traced the faint scratch marks where someone had corrected the text. My stomach tightened at the thought that they had taken the time to conceal me so deliberately. The room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint pulse of traffic below. I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes. Not to cry. There was no space for that. There was only a cold awareness settling through me like winter air. I lowered myself onto the couch and let the stillness deepen. It felt familiar. The same kind of stillness I had learned as a child when Richard would smile at Lena for something simple like a drawing while telling me Lena is the smart one. You are the sensitive one, sensitive. The word had never been a compliment. It had always meant fragile or inconvenient, a liability. Even now, decades later, the memory of it clung to my skin with the same quiet sting. I unfolded the document again and stared at the signature, the slanted strokes, the date, the seal. Proof disguised as legitimacy. Proof that someone believed I would not notice. Proof that they underestimated me. I needed air. Not outside air, but the kind that comes from understanding rather than confusion. I reached for my laptop on the coffee table. The glow of the screen lit up the room as I opened the banking dashboard for my company. Hearth Denver, Hearth Boulder, Hearth Colorado Springs, Hearth Santa Fe. Each account loaded with its familiar numbers, profit margins, expenses, vendor payments. I scrolled slowly, letting the routine of it calm me. Then something caught my eye. A transfer 2 months before Arthur died, not from my accounts, from his. A large sum moved into an entity I did not recognize, Hayes Legacy Holdings, LLC. The name hit me with a quiet jolt, legacy. They had chosen a word that sounded righteous to mask something deeply wrong. I clicked through to the transaction details. The transfer had been authorized by someone else. I stared at the numbers until they blurred slightly. My hand steadied. The shock from earlier condensed into something sharper. Not anger yet, more like precision, a tightening of focus. I leaned back into the couch cushions and breathed slowly, as if my body knew it needed to conserve strength for whatever came next. I closed the banking tab and opened my email to revisit the message from Arthur, the forwarded drafts of legal documents he had once wanted me to review. My eyes drifted to a folder I had not opened in months. Private Legal Folder Arthur. I had almost forgotten it existed. My breath pulled short for a moment before settling into something steady. I clicked it. Inside were scanned letters, old statements, attachments with long file names, notes Arthur had typed during the final months of his life. I clicked through them one by one, feeling the familiar ache rise in my chest because these documents were his voice now, his presence distilled into paper and pixels. Then I saw it. A scanned draft of his will dated weeks before the final version. I opened it. The words appeared slowly as if giving me time to absorb them. To my granddaughter, Quinn Hayes. Quinn. Not Lena. My name printed clearly without edits. My inheritance preserved in his original intention. My throat tightened, but I held the emotion in place like something fragile balanced on a fingertip. The truth was not just visible. It was undeniable. I closed my eyes and let the silence stretch. Somewhere inside that quiet, the pain grew heavier, but so did something else. Resolve. I stayed on the couch with the document open on my lap as the hours slipped between 2100 and 2300. The city noise softened until it felt like nothing outside existed except the line of text on the screen and the distant echo of Arthur's voice. They do not see you now. but they will. I opened my eyes and looked at the draft again. The original will, my name still standing. The confirmation that what they tried to steal had been mine all along. The betrayal burned cold but clean. It did not cloud my thoughts. It clarified them. I closed the laptop gently and sat in the near darkness, letting the moment anchor itself. I was no longer simply the daughter who played hotel. I was the granddaughter Arthur trusted, the builder he saw before anyone else did, and tomorrow would be the first step toward proving it. Later that night, around 11:30, I sat back down on the couch with the laptop still warm from earlier and opened the private legal folder. Arthur again. The world outside my windows had gone darker and quieter, but inside the apartment the air felt charged, as if something in the room was waiting for me to see it. I clicked on an email dated 10 days before Arthur died. The subject line was short but heavy with intent. For Quinn. The message opened slowly, and his words appeared as if he were speaking from just across the room. If Richard tries to move what is meant for you, do not confront him. Prove it. My breath caught because there was no hesitation in his phrasing, no possibility that he was guessing. He had known. He had prepared. I scrolled down and saw his signature at the bottom of the email, typed, not written, but familiar in the way someone you love fits into your understanding of the world. I leaned closer, trying to understand how long he had carried this suspicion, how much he had seen that I had not. I opened the scanned draft of his will on one side of the screen and the altered version on the other. The contrast was unsettling in its clarity. The signatures were similar at first glance, but not identical. Arthur's handwriting always had a small inward curve on the first letter of his last name. In the altered version, the curve was missing entirely. A small detail, but I had spent years noticing details. I traced the signature with my eyes and felt the first flicker of certainty rise. This was not his mark. The notary numbers did not match either. The draft showed one number and an older date. The new will had another number from another office, and the witness list had changed. The witness on the original draft was someone named Harris. The witness on the altered one was someone I had never heard of. I stared at the screen and a chill threaded through me. This was not a misunderstanding or a clerical error. This was intentional. I remembered how Richard had slid the folder away from me in the conference room that morning, the exact way his fingers curled around the edge of it, the quiet confidence of someone who believed no one would challenge him. Now, looking at the mismatched dates and the mismatched signatures, I could see why he had believed that. He thought I would accept it the way I had accepted everything else in the family, quietly, without protest. I rubbed the side of my thumb against my forehead and kept reading. The email continued. Your father is drowning in debt, Quinn. He is dangerous when desperate. Dangerous. The word pulsed on the screen. It made something shift in me, a painful recognition. I had seen hints of desperation, but I had always pushed them aside as stress or bad luck. The occasional angry phone call Richard ended quickly when I walked into the room. The sudden refusal to discuss finances, the tense smile he wore when someone asked about the family business. I had thought it was embarrassment. Now I understood it had been fear. I scrolled to the next paragraph. I kept the original document secure, but I know Richard. If he believes he is entitled, or if he believes Lena is more deserving, he may try to twist my intentions. Do not let him. My fingers tightened around the laptop edge until the plastic creaked softly. To know that Arthur had seen this coming and still died before he could stop it weighed heavily on me. I felt the old ache of missing him rise in my throat, but I kept reading because he had left this for me not to mourn him, but to act. I clicked on the attachments listed beneath the message. The first was the draft I had already reviewed. The second was a set of notes Arthur had typed outlining his reasoning for each beneficiary. Under my name, he had written in clear, firm language, Quinn understands the business. She has vision. She sees potential where others see risk. She will keep Hearth alive. I touched the words on the screen lightly with one fingertip. Grief and resolve twisted together in a slow, painful knot. He had trusted me more than anyone else had ever trusted me, more than my own father had ever trusted me. I opened another attachment. This one was a list of assets, properties, accounts, trusts. Near the bottom, I froze when I saw a line written in Arthur's clipped, careful style. 25% stake in Hayes and Hearth Holdings to Quinn only. My pulse thudded once then again harder. 25%, undisclosed. I opened the file attached to that line. It was a contract drafted but never finalized, showing his intention to transfer that stake to me, separate from the will and protected from challenge by any other heir. I read it twice, letting the meaning seep in. He had not only wanted me to inherit, he had wanted to ensure the company's future remained in the hands of someone who understood it, not someone drowning in debt, not someone playing the role of a successful businessman while hiding overdue loans, not someone who saw the family legacy as a way to patch his financial collapses. I sat back and let the enormity of it settle. The $26 million was only part of what had been stolen. The company, the legacy, the direction of our entire family name had been placed in my hands years before this moment, and Richard had tried to erase that. He had taken a pen and crossed out my name. He had replaced it with his preferred daughter. He had gambled that I would never look closely enough to see the truth. I closed the laptop carefully as if the documents inside were fragile. My apartment was silent, but the sense of movement around me had changed. The night no longer felt heavy. It felt alert, awake. I held the knowledge in my hands like a match burning toward fire. 26 million stolen, a will altered, a father dangerous when desperate, and a share of the company my grandfather wanted for me alone. I exhaled slowly. Tomorrow would not be about confrontation. It would be about proof exactly as Arthur had told me. I set the laptop down and leaned back, letting the weight of the evening settle into something sharper than pain. Purpose. In the dark of my living room with the city lights flickering below, I whispered the words that shaped the air with quiet certainty. They do not see me now, but they will. The next day, the morning air felt colder than usual as I stepped into the driver's seat and headed toward Hearth, Denver. The sky was a pale, muted blue, the kind that looks almost washed out by the sun, even though the sun has barely risen. My mind was steady sharper than it had been in weeks, and every mile that carried me closer to the flagship hotel made that clarity settle deeper. By the time I pulled into the private parking area, the quiet resolve inside me felt almost physical. The staff recognized my car instantly, and as I walked through the glass doors, the front desk manager straightened with immediate respect. "Good morning, Miss Hayes." His tone carried none of the polite detachment reserved for guests. This was acknowledgement of ownership, of leadership, of someone who built the beating heart of the place he worked in. I nodded lightly, grateful for the steadiness his greeting gave me. The lobby was warm with the familiar scent of cedar and citrus, the signature fragrance line I had developed years earlier when the hotel first opened. It always calmed me, but today it did more than that. Today it reminded me who I was beyond yesterday's humiliation. Claire, the CFO, spotted me before I even reached the center of the room. She moved quickly across the lobby, a folder tucked under her arm and concern pressed across her face. "You were here earlier than usual, Quinn," she said quietly. "Something happened yesterday, did it not?" I exhaled once the words forming with the same raw sting they had carried when I first heard them. "They gave Lena my $26 million. Claire stopped walking. For a moment, she did not blink. "They what?" I repeated it calmly, but she heard the undercurrent beneath the calm. Her jaw tightened the way it always did when she encountered something profoundly unjust. She had been with the company long enough to know what Arthur intended for me, and she had respected him almost as much as I did. "That is not possible," she said finally, then corrected herself. "It should not have been possible. Come with me." We stepped into a side office overlooking the lobby, and the second the door closed, Claire placed the folder on the table, flipping it open to reveal the most recent financial reports for all 4 hotels. Before she could speak, I placed both hands on the table and said, "I need you to print every transfer that came from my grandfather's accounts in the last 6 months. All of it. Every penny. Every movement." Claire did not hesitate. "On it. And one more thing," I said as she turned to leave. "Call my personal attorney. Tell him I want the original will from probate court. No summaries, no duplicates, the physical document." Claire paused, her eyes widening slightly. "That's serious?" "Yes." She nodded once, then hurried out. I sat alone in the office with the afternoon sun beginning to spill across the polished wooden floor. My heart was steady now, not racing, not frantic. Steady like someone who had finally seen the shape of the truth and was ready to face it head on. A few minutes later, Claire returned, carrying a stack of printed statements thick enough to indicate trouble even before I read a single line. She placed them in front of me. The last 6 months, Quinn. I flipped through the pages with my finger tracing the transactions the same way I had traced the forged signature the night before. The further I read, the deeper the knot in my stomach twisted. A company name appeared repeatedly, a name I had never heard until last night. Hayes Legacy Holdings, LLC, a company formed 2 weeks before Arthur died. The confirmation hit me like a slow, cold wave. It belonged to Richard. It was all I needed to see to understand his desperation. Claire leaned over, scanning the document. "That is your father's name on the registration," she said quietly. "He formed this while your grandfather was still alive." I nodded once. That was escalation. That was intent. Claire stared at me with a mix of anger and loyalty. "You know," she said softly, "you could outbuy all of them tomorrow, right?" The softness in her voice came from care, not arrogance. She knew what the hotels brought in. She knew the kind of independent wealth I had built long before this fight. But I shook my head. That is not the point. She leaned back slightly, waiting. "This is not about proving I have more money than they think. This is about what he stole from my grandfather's wishes." She closed the folder slowly and nodded. Understood. Her agreement grounded me. It made the next steps feel bigger than anger. It made them feel righteous. I turned back to the stack of documents, and in the lower part of one page, something caught my eye. A loan document. A home equity line of credit, but not attached to Richard's house, not attached to any property I expected. Instead, it was attached to one of the older hotels, the one Arthur had bought 40 years ago, before anything in this family resembled wealth. My throat tightened. "He used my grandfather's property to take a HELOC loan," Claire whispered. "Without permission, without disclosure, without inheritance." I stared at the paper, the words sinking in with heavy finality. So they had not just taken my name off a line in a document. They had taken money. They had taken property. They had taken debt and tied it to the legacy I was meant to protect. I lifted the sheet of paper slowly, letting it hover between my fingers as the last piece of the morning slid into place. This was far bigger than humiliation. This was theft, both moral and legal. And that meant I had every right to take the next step. The mini hook caught in my chest, not spoken, but felt as absolute clarity. My father had gambled with the wrong piece of the family legacy. Starting now, I would make sure he understood exactly what that meant. Over the next 24 hours, the quiet office beside the Hearth Denver lobby became a command center. The blinds stayed half closed to keep the morning light from glaring across the screens, and the steady hum of the building's air system filled the space like background tension. Claire sat beside me with her laptop open while I spread the printed statements across the table in a timeline. Page after page, transactions formed a trail that no one had expected me to follow. No one except Arthur. The first entry we examined was a transfer of $5 million. It had gone directly into the account of Richard's failing company. Claire tapped the line with the end of her pen. "This looks like debt payment," she murmured. "Not optional debt. Overdue." I inhaled slowly. So he used my inheritance to save his sinking business before pretending it had ever belonged to Lena. Claire glanced at me, but she knew better than to speak the sympathy that flickered across her expression. We moved to the next entry. $3 million wired into an investment portfolio under Lena's name. The description read high-yield opportunity funds. It was a phrase people used when they did not want to say risky investments or unstable markets. Claire shook her head softly. "They did this before the will reading," she said. "They acted as though it was already theirs." I kept scanning the page, letting each line settle in like another small stone added to a growing weight. Another page revealed a transfer of $1 million used as a down payment for a new house for Lena. The paperwork showed it had closed just days before Arthur's passing. My breath tightened, not from surprise now, but from confirmation. They were not waiting for anything. They had already spent $8 million like loose change. And there were more entries. Smaller but still deliberate payments. Luxury purchases. Travel. Business consultants charging steep fees for a company that was never going to recover. A picture formed piece by piece with every new line we read. They had begun consuming my inheritance before anyone in the family sat down in that glass room at the law office. They had counted on me being quiet the way I had always been around them. The idea pressed against my ribs with an ache that felt sharper than anger. Claire looked up from her laptop. "Quinn," she said gently, "if you had not come in today, they would have burned through everything in a matter of months." I nodded but kept my eyes on the page. That was the most painful part. Not the theft itself, but how certain they were that I would never catch them. I lifted the next statement and traced the dates. The money had been moving steadily every 2 or 3 weeks, enough that it looked controlled if someone skimmed, but obvious when arranged chronologically. The more I aligned the papers, the more the strategy revealed itself in patterns. Pay off debt, funnel money into Lena's accounts, secure property under her name, protect nothing for Arthur's wishes, protect nothing for the company he built. The unfairness pulsed through the room, thick and unignorable. Claire closed her laptop for a moment and rubbed her forehead. "It is worse than I expected," she admitted quietly. "They are bleeding the estate dry." I felt the air tighten around me, but I forced myself to stay steady. Pain was allowed. Paralysis was not. We kept going through the statements line by line, reading every transfer and category until the table was covered in paper, like a map of betrayal and carelessness. Every 20 or 30 seconds, we found another transaction, another example of the inheritance shrinking under their hands, another confirmation that I was right to act now before the damage spread further. I picked up one of the pages again and looked at the timestamp. This one had been processed the morning of the will reading. They were spending my money hours before the document was even presented. Something in me settled with cold clarity. This was no longer about what they believed of me as a daughter or sister. This was about survival of the legacy my grandfather trusted me with. Claire looked at me as if she sensed the shift. "What is your next move?" I did not answer right away. Instead, I stacked the papers into a clean, neat pile and pressed my palm gently along the top to flatten the edges. The act steadied me. I reached across the desk and took a fresh folder, a sturdy, hard-backed one reserved for board meetings. I slid each page into the folder, arranging the timeline of transactions in a way any outsider could follow instantly. When I finished, I lifted the folder and wrote on the front cover in dark ink, "For the next family meeting." Claire watched with a slow nod of approval. "They will not expect this," she said quietly. "No," I replied. "They expect the quiet daughter, the dreamy decorator, the one with no head for numbers." Claire allowed herself a dry exhale that almost passed as a laugh. "They are about to learn what you really know." I closed the cap of the pen and stood with the folder in my hand. The weight of it grounded me. It was not heavy, but it carried everything they had tried to hide, everything they had already consumed, everything they believed they had secured. I looked through the office window at the lobby, bathed now in soft gold light from the morning sun. People passed through without knowing the shift that had happened in me in the last day, the transformation from endurance to intention. I turned back to Claire. "Thank you for helping me trace this." She shook her head. "This is what Arthur wanted you to do." I nodded. "Yes, and now I will." The mini hook tightened inside me as I pressed the folder against my chest. The next family meeting would not be a conversation. It would be the moment everything they had done stood in the open. And for the first time, they would have to face the daughter they had underestimated. Sunday, March 17th arrived with a quiet brightness over Denver, the kind of late winter sunlight that made the city look cleaner than it really was. By noon, the lobby of Hearth Denver was full of weekend travelers, but my attention stayed fixed on the private dining area I had reserved. The polished wood tables and soft light were calming, yet underneath the calmness, my pulse had a steady, deliberate rhythm. Today was the setup. Not the reveal yet, but the moment they would walk straight into the place they had mocked for years without realizing it was mine. I had invited them with a simple message saying now that the Will situation seems resolved, I would love a family lunch at my hotel to celebrate. There was no celebration in my voice, but they never noticed things like that. They only heard what they wanted to hear. Richard arrived first wearing a suit that looked a little too expensive for a man drowning in debt. Lena followed in a bright dress with a confidence that was almost loud. They did not greet the staff. They did not look around with curiosity. They walked in as though they were entering some small cafe I had chosen for aesthetics, rather than the flagship property of a growing hotel chain. They sat down, and the conversation began exactly as I expected. Richard leaned back in his chair with a satisfied breath and said, "26 million will save the family business." He sounded proud, as though he had earned a windfall rather than stolen it. Lena adjusted her sleeve and added, "Finally, something good came out of Dad's sacrifices." The words came effortlessly. There was no guilt, no hesitation, only entitlement. They still believed Hearth Denver was a place I decorated like a hobby, a backdrop I used to feel productive. They had no idea they were sitting in the heart of the empire they had dismissed. I let them talk. It was always better to let entitled people reveal themselves without prompting. Their voices carried just enough for the servers to glance over politely before returning to their tasks. I kept my expression neutral, the same expression that had carried me through every childhood dinner when I had learned being quiet was safer. A few minutes later, our general manager approached the table. He nodded respectfully to me, then said, "Ms. Hayes, the board documents you requested are ready whenever you want them." He said it clearly without ambiguity, and his tone carried weight. Richard's eyebrows pulled together. Board documents, he repeated slowly like the words did not make sense in this setting. For a moment, he looked at me with confusion but not suspicion yet. Suspicion required giving me credit, and he had spent a lifetime avoiding that. I looked up at the manager and said softly, "Thank you. Bring them here, please." When he walked away, Richard asked, "What kind of board is this exactly?" His voice carried faint irritation that usually appeared when he felt out of the loop. I did not answer directly. Instead, I opened the leather folder placed in front of me and began signing the first of several documents. Each signature authorized a staff restructure. Each signature had weight in this building because legally and operationally, this building answered to me. Lena watched my hand move across the page. She tilted her head like she was trying to interpret an unfamiliar language. "Dad," she whispered under her breath. "What is she signing?" Before he could respond, the manager returned with the next set of documents. "Here are the updated GM adjustments and the new oversight approvals, Ms. Hayes." He nodded to me, then stepped back. Richard stared not at the manager, but at me. He finally spoke more quietly this time, "What is going on?" I lifted my gaze and offered the faintest cordial smile, nothing dramatic but intentional, just routine operations. Lena blinked. Routine operations for what exactly? Her voice carried the first trace of uncertainty. I closed the folder gently and set my pen on top of it. The silence that followed was short, but heavy. I could feel the shift, the subtle realization pressing against their assumptions. Claire's words from 2 days earlier echoed you could outbuy all of them tomorrow. She was right, but money was not the point. Justice was. I placed both hands on the table in a calm, controlled gesture and said I thought we should continue this conversation upstairs. I have a room prepared. Room, she repeated. For lunch. No, for a family discussion. The manager approached again as if on cue. Miss Hayes, the 10th floor conference room is ready whenever you are. I thanked him, then stood smoothing my jacket. Richard looked between me and the manager, then at the lobby beyond the glass divider. Something in his face flickered the earliest hint that perhaps he had underestimated the setting he walked into. I stepped aside from the table slightly and gestured for them to follow. Lena grabbed her purse, hesitating for the first time all afternoon. What is this? Her voice small, but trying not to sound it. I kept my tone level. Just clarity. It is time we discuss things with everyone in the room who needs to be there. She looked at her father, but his expression had tightened. He was replaying every interaction since he entered the hotel, every staff member addressing me with respect, every nod, every yes, Miss Hayes. A crack formed in his composure, though he tried to hide it. As we walked toward the elevators, several employees greeted me quietly. None of them looked surprised to see me leading the group toward the executive floor. When the elevator doors opened and we stepped inside, the mirrored walls reflected the tension back at us. No one spoke on the ride up. The 10th floor opened into a private corridor lined with framed photos of the hotel's milestones. Lena's eyes darted to one of them, showing Arthur and me cutting the ribbon at the opening ceremony. She frowned but said nothing. I led them to the glass-walled conference room where the city skyline stretched behind the long table. Waiting inside was my attorney seated calmly with a laptop open and several neatly organized binders. Richard froze at the doorway. What is this Quinn? I met his eyes without flinching. Our family meeting. Then I walked inside, leaving them standing on the threshold as the truth edged closer. The conference room door clicked shut behind us just after 1 in the afternoon, and the air shifted immediately. The 10th floor always felt quieter than the rest of the hotel, but today, the stillness carried weight. Richard and Lena paused just inside as if the room itself held authority they had not expected. Claire stood near the far end of the table with a stack of binders, calm and composed. My attorney was seated with his laptop open, and beside him a representative from the probate court reviewed a thin folder with the neutral expression of someone who had seen too many families unravel over money. I walked to the front of the room where the large screen waited. The remote felt cool in my hand as I pressed the first button. The screen lit up with the original will. The header was clear, the date correct, Arthur's signature steady and familiar. My name was printed exactly where it had always belonged. Richard inhaled sharply. Lena blinked fast as though the image would change if she stared hard enough. Before they could speak, I clicked again. The altered version filled the screen. Different date, different notary, witness signatures that did not match, and the most damning change, a clumsy line striking through to my granddaughter, Quinn Hayes, replaced by to my granddaughter, Lena Hayes. The room stayed silent long enough for the truth to echo. I then clicked again, and the financial flowchart appeared. Colored arrows showed funds moving from Arthur's accounts in the final months of his life. $5 million transferred to cover Richard's business debts. $3 million funneled into a risky investment account under Lena's name. $1 million used as a down payment on Lena's new house. Additional amounts directed into Hayes Legacy Holdings, LLC, the shell company Richard had created 2 weeks before Arthur died. Lastly, the document showing they had used that company to secure a line of credit by placing one of Arthur's old hotel properties as collateral. I watched their faces, not the screen. Richard's jaw tightened until a muscle twitched above it. Lena's mouth hung slightly open. The courthouse representative finally lifted his eyes from the paper in front of him, but did not yet speak. Richard was the first to break the silence. His voice cracked, but he tried to make it sound paternal. "You are my daughter, and we are fixing the family. You have no idea what kind of pressure we were under." I stepped forward just enough to make my words land exactly where they needed to. "You did not fix the family, Dad. You robbed the only person who actually built something." His face flushed, a deep shade of red. He tried to gesture toward the charts as though waving away facts would erase them. "You have always been too emotional, Quinn. You do not understand how business works. This money helps all of us. That is what families do." Claire let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but controlled. My attorney clicked his pen once, and the courthouse representative finally stood. He spoke in a steady, formal tone. "Based on what we have reviewed today, the estate assets are temporarily frozen. The validity of the most recent will is being formally questioned, and the original appears to carry stronger legal standing. Further investigation will begin immediately." Richard turned toward him sharply. "Frozen. You cannot freeze what belongs to us." The representative answered with complete detachment. "At this moment, nothing belongs to you, Mr. Hayes, not until the court determines which document is authentic." Lena shifted in her chair as though the ground beneath her had tilted. She looked at the financial chart again, the arrows tracing back to her accounts. All the color drained from her face. I advanced another slide showing copies of the HELOC paperwork attached to the hotel property her father had used as collateral. Claire spoke then, her tone gentle but unmistakably firm. "This property does not belong to Hayes Legacy Holdings, as the application claims. It belongs to Hearth Denver's historical portfolio. Using it as collateral is considered a fraudulent act." Richard shook his head, refusing to accept the reality forming around him. He pointed at me again. "You set us up. You waited for us to make a mistake, then you dragged us here to embarrass us." I raised my chin slightly. "You embarrassed yourselves. I simply gathered what you left behind." Without warning, Lena's voice broke through the tension, a thin, trembling sound. "Does this mean I owe all that money back?" Her words were small, but they carried across the room like a dropped glass. She looked down at her hands, then pressed them against her forehead, as if trying to hold her world together. The courthouse representative closed his folder. "All expenditures from these transfers will be subject to review. Funds spent improperly may need to be returned." My attorney added quietly, "And depending on how the court categorizes the intent, there may be civil penalties." Richard sank into the nearest chair, the earlier arrogance gone, replaced with something hollow and frightened. He looked older in that moment, smaller. Not the man who had dragged a folder out of my hands 2 days earlier, declaring I never built anything. I let the room breathe for a moment. The skyline shimmered beyond the glass, the city carrying on with its day, unaware of the storm unfolding on the 10th floor. I turned the screen off. The silence that followed felt final, like the last note of a long song, finally settling into stillness. "This is not about revenge," I said softly but firmly. "This is about restoring what my grandfather intended. He trusted me because I earned that trust." The probate representative nodded, once confirming the point. "We will proceed with the freeze immediately. The court will be in contact." He gathered his things and left the room. Claire remained standing beside me, offering quiet, steady support. Richard did not look at me again. Lena kept her eyes on the table, her phone face down beside her like a lifeline that no longer worked. The truth was out. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniably present, just like I intended. 1 week after the exposure, everything around my father and sister began collapsing, exactly the way fragile structures fall once the truth finally kicks out the supports beneath them. By the last week of March 2024, the consequences had gathered speed and weight. Richard was hit first. His phone rang so often that even people who had known him for decades started noticing the way he flinched at every vibration. The bank called repeatedly demanding updated financial statements and immediate repayment on lines of credit he had opened under Hayes Legacy Holdings, LLC. The freeze placed on the estate meant he had no access to the money he believed he would have control over. One by one, the debts he had previously shuffled between accounts came forward like unwanted visitors, refusing to wait any longer. Lena's situation unfolded just as quickly. She received a certified letter informing her that the down payment on her new house was now under legal review, and that without verified proof of legitimate funds, she would need to return that payment or face foreclosure proceedings before she had even finished unpacking. A second letter stated that the remaining transfers into her investment account were being flagged as improper and that she could be liable for repayment plus penalties. The confidence she had always carried, the kind built on my father's praise rather than her own achievements, vanished. She withdrew from social media and stopped answering texts from friends who wondered why construction on her new home had suddenly halted. The day they both arrived at my hotel, I saw their reflections in the glass revolving doors before I saw them directly. They looked smaller somehow, the kind of defeated posture that comes from realizing the future you stole was never really yours. I was standing in the lobby reviewing an event schedule with a concierge when the doors turned and Richard and Lena stepped inside. Their eyes moved across the polished marble floor, scanning for me, like people searching for a lifeline they had once thrown away. I waited for them to approach. Richard reached me first. His voice was thin and stretched. "If you do not help, they will take everything." I met his eyes without flinching. They were never yours to begin with. That sentence seemed to land in him like an echo of every truth he had tried to avoid. He lowered himself into one of the lobby chairs as though the weight of the past week had finally settled onto his shoulders. Lena stood beside him, clutching her phone. She opened her mouth twice before any sound came out. "They say I have to sell the house," she finally whispered. "I might owe all of it back." I let her words hang there without cushioning them. I thought of the moment in the conference room when she asked that exact question with the same trembling fear. They expected compassion, but they had relied on that compassion as a shield for too many years. Richard straightened, suddenly trying to recover some piece of the authority he once wielded. "We were under pressure," he said. "You know how hard it has been. The family business needed stability. If we can fix this, we will be better, and we will respect you this time." His voice thinned on the final words as though he already knew how hollow they sounded. I stepped a little closer. "You respected my money before you respected me. That is not family." The lobby remained quiet around us. Guests checked in politely and staff moved through their routines, but none of that interrupted the stillness between us. It was the kind of stillness that forms when truth has been laid out without disguise. Richard leaned forward, gripping his hands together. His voice dropped. "Quinn, you can stop this. You can help. You have the ability. You could solve all of it today." I took a breath, steady and even. Yes, I could. And that is exactly why I will not. Their eyes widened at the same time. For years, they had counted on my reluctance to cause conflict, trusting that I would always put the family above myself. That version of me no longer existed, but I am willing to offer one thing, I continued. No money, no bailouts, no free rescue. I will pay for a lawyer to help you avoid jail or larger penalties, but you will walk through every step yourself. Richard stared at me, stunned. A lawyer? But no funds, no transfer, no loan, no rescue. Exactly. My voice remained calm. If you want to rebuild, do it with honesty. He looked away, his shoulders collapsing inward. Lena's eyes filled with a grief that was not about losing money, but about realizing that their safety net had finally disappeared. She whispered thank you, but it sounded more like a memory of gratitude than an actual expression of it. I left them sitting there in the lobby under the warm lights and the soft music of the hotel's afternoon playlist. Guests passed by, unaware that the two people at the center of my childhood had arrived at the place where consequences live. Behind me, I heard Richard exhale a long, uneven breath. It was the sound of a man who realized too late that he had treated the wrong daughter as disposable. I did not turn back. I had given them exactly what justice allowed: a chance to confront the damage they created and an opportunity to rebuild under their own weight, not a dollar more. By September 2024, the weight of every choice my father and sister had made settled into something solid, something undeniable, something neither of them could outrun any longer. Consequences have a way of arriving slowly at first, then all at once. And by the end of summer, both of them were living inside the reality they had tried so hard to push onto me instead. Richard's downfall began with a formal notice that Hayes Legacy Holdings, LLC, no longer met solvency requirements. Once the estate freeze became official and the probate court confirmed that the will was being reviewed for possible alteration, every creditor who had once given my father grace began demanding repayment. He had no access to the $26 million he thought he had secured, and without it, his business, the one he had always bragged about as the backbone of our family, could not survive another quarter. He sold it in July for far less than its previous valuation, simply to cover outstanding debt. It was the kind of sale that made local whispers travel quickly. By August, he had moved out of his suburban home and into a small rental apartment on the edge of Aurora, the kind of place with beige walls and old carpet where you could hear your neighbor's TV through the vents. For a man who once lectured me about ambition, the contrast was striking. Lena's collapse looked different, but was no less complete. The house she had proudly toured on video calls, the one she had furnished with money taken from my inheritance, had to be listed almost immediately. She returned every dollar that had been traced to illegal transfers, including the $3 million moved into her investment account. Her portfolio was emptied to cover penalties, and her credit plummeted. When school resumed in August, she enrolled her son in a more affordable program near her apartment, a decision that made her cry in the parking lot as she explained to him why he could no longer attend the school she had promised would be permanent. I watched all of this not with satisfaction, but with the steady clarity of someone who finally understood that justice does not require joy. It simply requires truth. Probate court finished its review in early September. The representative called me saying the original will, the one my grandfather had signed with his usual deliberate handwriting, had been reinstated. There was no debate left, no alternate reading. The $26 million was formally mine. But the truth is, the money was never the heart of it. Hearing the court say your grandfather intended this for you, Quinn felt like a door closing gently, finally sealing off the doubt they had tried to plant in me for years. When the transfer cleared, I sat in my office at Hearth, Denver, with the city stretching out below me. I opened the digital statement showing the funds and exhaled once slow and controlled. It was not triumph, it was alignment. With the money secured, I made a decision within minutes. I allocated several million to establish a hotel scholarship fund named the Arthur Hayes Hospitality Grant. It would support young people who wanted to learn the craft of service design and hotel management, the same path my grandfather introduced me to when he handed me the keys to that rundown motel in 2018. When I signed the founding document, I imagined him standing beside me in the hallway, like he had that day, saying, "They do not see you now, but they will." Using part of the inheritance for something that lifted others felt right, felt clean, like stepping fully into the legacy he meant for me to carry. It also reminded me that although my father had tried to use money as a weapon, it could just as easily become a tool for restoration. News of the scholarship spread quietly through the hotel community. A few industry leaders reached out expressing admiration for the initiative, and by late September, several tourism organizations asked to participate. It was the opposite of the chaos my father and sister were experiencing. They were shrinking. My world was expanding. And yet none of it changed the boundary I held. I did not reach out to them. They were living the outcome of their own choices, and for the first time I understood that stepping back was not cruelty, it was protection. One afternoon near the end of the month, my lawyer knocked on my office door holding a small cream-colored envelope. No sender listed, no logo. Just my name written in old-fashioned pen strokes I recognized instantly. Quinn. He said this was held in Arthur's personal file with instructions to deliver once the will was resolved. My breath caught a little. I opened it carefully, smoothing the paper flat. Inside was a single sheet written in my grandfather's steady handwriting. I always knew you would do the right thing even when they did not. The words were simple, but they reached into a place inside me untouched by the legal battles, the insults, the manipulation, and the months of pressure. It felt like he had spoken directly into the present from a time before everything fractured. I folded the paper slowly and placed it into my desk drawer, knowing I would keep it there as long as I remained part of this business, part of this legacy. Justice had not been loud, it had not been dramatic, it had been steady, methodical, inevitable. And by September 2024, every part of my life finally reflected that. By December 2024, the air in Denver carried that cold, crisp quiet that always settles over the city right before Christmas. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without waiting for something to go wrong. The chaos that had surrounded the will, the investigation, and the unraveling of my father and sister's schemes had finally faded into the background, like a storm that had moved on, leaving the streets washed clean. What remained was a stillness I had never known while being tied to that version of family. On the evening of December 24th, I walked the main hallway of Hearth Denver, the hotel my grandfather had once told me could become the heart of the brand if handled with care. Soft music drifted from the lobby and garlands wrapped the railings, but what struck me most was the warmth of the space, not just in decoration, but in the way the staff spoke to one another, the way guests lingered near the fireplace, and the way every corner held a quiet sense of safety. As I walked, I ran my hand along the polished wood of the banister and thought of my grandfather standing in a similar hallway years earlier, telling me that hospitality was never about buildings, but about people. It was impossible not to think of him as Christmas lights reflected in the windows. There was no ache this time, only gratitude. I reached the mezzanine and paused, looking out over the lobby bustling with holiday travelers checking in, couples holding hands, children pointing at the tall tree near the entrance. This was a place built from intention, not ego, and I felt every bit of that difference sinking in. I realized I had not checked my phone for hours. There was a time not long ago when every vibration made my stomach tighten, expecting a demand, a guilt trip, a text from my father dripping with disappointment or entitlement. But since the probate ruling, since the final boundaries had been set, since the last conversation in the lobby, where he admitted nothing yet expected, everything, something inside me had closed a door he no longer had keys to. I no longer lived in anticipation of his voice. My phone sat silent in my pocket, and I did not feel the urge to reach for it even once. When I walked toward the staff wing, a small cluster of employees stepped out from the service corridor, holding paper cups of cocoa and wearing Santa hats slightly crooked. Claire stood among them, smiling widely. "Quinn, we just wanted to thank you," one of the front desk associates said, "for keeping this place together. If Richard had gotten his hands on the hotels, we all know what would have happened." Another added, "You protected the legacy, but you protected us too." It was a small gathering, maybe a dozen people, but the sincerity in their faces hit deeper than I expected. They handed me a cup and lifted theirs to clink gently, to Hearth and to Hayes. "The right Hayes," someone joked softly. The group laughed, not unkindly. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, not the sharp kind born from vindication, but the steady kind born from belonging. After the small party ended and the employees returned to their stations, I wandered toward the exterior entrance, where the hotel name glowed against the night sky. Hayes and Hearth, in clean, bright lettering, the combination my grandfather had chosen before he ever knew how the family fractures would unfold. I stood there with snow gathering lightly at my feet and whispered, "We did it, Grandpa." The words carried no bitterness, only truth. They felt like a ribbon being tied on the final chapter of a very long, heavy story. As I turned back toward the lobby, a man in his 70s wearing a dark wool coat and carrying a small leather bag stepped inside, shaking the snow from his shoulders. He looked around slowly as though absorbing the feel of the place before he approached the front desk. When he finished checking in, he lingered near me, his eyes drawn to the architecture, then to the holiday lights. "This place feels like someone actually cares," he said with a gentle smile. "That is rare." I thanked him and walked away, but his words stayed with me long after. They summed up everything I had fought for without even knowing that was what I was fighting for. The truth was not about proving my father wrong or reclaiming the 26 million, or even restoring the will. It was about building a life where care replaced control, where truth replaced pressure, and where peace replaced performance. By the time I reached the elevator, I felt a quiet settle inside me deeper than any victory could ever bring. The toxic ties that once kept me braced for impact had lost their power. I was no longer defined by what my father tried to take or by what my sister believed she deserved. I was defined by what I built, what I protected, and what I chose not to carry anymore. December 2024 was the first month I truly understood what freedom from a toxic family felt like, and it was quieter, softer, and more beautiful than I had ever imagined. By the time evening settled over Denver on that December night, the city felt wrapped in a quiet, white calm that softened every sound. I found myself in the lounge of Hearth Denver, sitting near the wide windows where snow drifted past in slow, steady lines, illuminated by the warm interior lights. The fireplace crackled behind me, filling the room with a kind of gentle hum that matched the rhythm of my breathing. It was the first time in a long time that I let myself simply sit without planning, without analyzing, without bracing. I watched flakes melt against the glass and thought about everything that had unfolded the past year, how every choice had led me to this quiet moment where peace finally felt like something I deserved rather than something I had to earn. The truth circled my thoughts in simple shapes. If I had stayed silent during the will reading, Lena would have taken the 26 million without hesitation, and she would have spent it quickly, just as she had with the transfers we had already traced. She would have treated it like an allowance, a cushion, a reward for doing nothing more than being favored. My grandfather's legacy would have been emptied into liabilities within months, and the hotels he cared for would have become bargaining chips in my father's desperate attempts to stay afloat. Silence would have destroyed everything he entrusted to me. And then there was the other thought, the one that had followed me for years in smaller ways. If I had forgiven them the way they expected, if I had stepped back into the role of the quiet daughter, if I had allowed them to keep pulling from me whenever they needed a patch for their mistakes, I would have been trapped in the same cycle that had shaped my childhood. A cycle where love meant compliance, where respect meant silence, where loyalty meant self-sacrifice. Giving them money again, even with the hope of repairing something, would not have been kindness. It would have been surrender. As I sat there, the snow falling thicker now, my mind returned to the moment in the probate office when the representative said the original will had been restored. It was not the 18 digits in the account that mattered. It was the acknowledgement that my grandfather had seen me clearly, in a way my father never had. It was the confirmation that I had honored his faith the way he hoped I would. That truth grounded me far more deeply than inheritance ever could. A couple across the lounge clinked their glasses softly, drawing my eyes for a moment. They were older, maybe late 60s, and the woman laughed in a way that suggested years of being fully herself without fear of being diminished. I wondered what it felt like to grow older with someone who chose to see you as you were, rather than who they needed you to be. That was something I was only beginning to understand. Money does not create character, it reveals it. My father's choices were not born the moment he altered the will. They were simply exposed there. His willingness to erase me had been growing in the shadows for years, fueled by debt's shame and his unyielding belief that control was the same thing as leadership. Lena's willingness to take what was not hers had been there too, tucked beneath her easy entitlement. The inheritance did not make them greedy. It gave their greed a larger canvas. As the thought settled, I whispered the words out loud, just enough for myself to hear. Money does not make people greedy. It just gives greedy people a bigger stage. Saying it brought with it a surprising warmth. It was not anger, it was clarity. The kind of clarity that lets you decide how you will move forward and what you will no longer carry. A server walked by and offered to refill my tea. When I thanked her, she smiled and said, "We are all glad you are here, Miss Hayes. This place is different because of you." Her words landed gently, grounding me in the present moment, reminding me that legacy is not built through inheritance, but through intention, through everyday choices, through the people who feel safe in the spaces you build. Outside the windows, the snow had begun to slow, falling in softer waves now. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle into me fully. I had stepped out of a toxic cycle into a life shaped by my own decisions. I had protected what mattered, and in doing so, I had discovered a kind of peace I did not know was possible. Before standing, I opened my phone, not out of habit, but purpose. I wrote a message for anyone who might be listening, for anyone who might need the permission I once needed myself. If you have ever had to walk away from your own family to protect your peace, tell me your city in the comments. You are not alone. Then I set the phone down, looked out at the quiet street, and let the truth of the past year settle into something final and whole.